The Russo-Japanese War was a pivotal moment in modern history, marking the dawn of a new era in global conflict and the rise of Asian powers. This war's impact resonated far beyond the battlefields of Manchuria, shaping the course of World War I and the fate of empires. In the late 19th century, the Russian Empire, under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, was expanding its influence in East Asia, driven by a desire to establish itself as a major power in the region. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which began in 1891, was a key component of this strategy, aiming to connect Moscow with Vladivostok and provide a direct link to the Pacific Ocean. This ambitious project, spanning over 9,000 kilometers, would not only facilitate trade and commerce, but also enable the rapid deployment of Russian troops to the Far East. As Russia's presence in the region grew, so did its interest in Manchuria, a fertile and resource-rich province in northeastern China. The area was crucial for Russia's economic and strategic ambitions, offering access to the Sea of Japan and the potential for significant trade and investment opportunities. However, this expansionist policy was not without its challenges, as it encroached upon the interests of other powers, notably Japan, which had been watching Russia's moves in the region with increasing concern. In Japan, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 had brought about a period of rapid modernization and industrialization, transforming the country from a feudal society into a modern nation-state. The Japanese government, led by Emperor Meiji and his advisors, was determined to assert its independence and protect its interests in East Asia. As Russia's influence in Manchuria grew, Japan began to feel threatened, fearing that its own access to the Asian continent and the Sea of Japan would be compromised. The seeds of conflict were sown in 1894, when Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, gaining control of Korea and Taiwan. This victory marked Japan's emergence as a significant regional power, but it also created tension with Russia, which had been backing China in the conflict. The Russian government, seeking to counterbalance Japanese influence, began to strengthen its military presence in Manchuria, deploying troops and constructing fortifications along the Chinese Eastern Railway. In 1898, Russia leased the Liaodong Peninsula from China, gaining control of the strategic port city of Port Arthur, which offered a year-round ice-free harbor and direct access to the Yellow Sea. This move was seen as a direct challenge by Japan, which had long considered the peninsula to be within its sphere of influence. The Japanese government, now more than ever, felt compelled to take action to protect its interests and prevent Russia from dominating the region. As tensions between Russia and Japan continued to escalate, diplomats from both nations engaged in a series of complex negotiations, attempting to resolve their differences through diplomatic means. In 1901, Japan proposed a mutual non-aggression pact, which would have recognized Russian control over Manchuria in exchange for Japanese dominance in Korea. However, the Russian government, confident in its military superiority and economic might, rejected this proposal, opting instead to continue its expansionist policy in East Asia. As the Russian government's rejection of Japan's proposal became clear, the Japanese leadership, led by Emperor Meiji and his advisors, including the influential General Kodama Gentaro, began to prepare for a potential conflict. In 1902, Japan signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance with Britain, which provided a significant boost to its diplomatic and military standing. This alliance not only guaranteed British neutrality in the event of a war between Japan and Russia, but also paved the way for Japan to secure crucial financial and military support from other Western powers. Meanwhile, in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II and his government remained confident in their ability to assert dominance over East Asia. The Russian naval presence in the region was strengthened, with the deployment of additional warships to the Pacific Fleet, headquartered at Port Arthur. However, this buildup only served to further escalate tensions with Japan, which saw the increasing Russian military presence as a direct threat to its national security. In January 1904, the Japanese government, realizing that diplomatic efforts had failed, decided to take decisive action. A naval attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur was planned and executed, catching the Russians off guard. On the night of February 8, 1904, Japanese torpedo boats launched a surprise assault on the Russian warships anchored in the harbor, sinking or damaging several vessels, including the battleships Retvizan and Tsarevich. This daring raid marked the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, as Japan sought to gain a strategic advantage by crippling the Russian naval presence in the region. The attack on Port Arthur was followed by a series of Japanese military victories, including the capture of the strategic port city of Kimulpo, now Incheon, in Korea, which provided a crucial foothold for further operations against Russian forces in Manchuria. As the war unfolded, the Japanese army, led by experienced generals such as Marshal Admiral Heihachido Togo and General Maresuke Nogi, demonstrated remarkable tactical prowess, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain and exploiting weaknesses in the Russian defenses. The Russian military response was hindered by inadequate logistics, poor communication, and a lack of coordination between its naval and land forces. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which had been touted as a symbol of Russian power and modernity, proved to be a double-edged sword as it became a vulnerable supply line that the Japanese sought to disrupt. As the Japanese army continued to gain momentum on land, their naval forces, led by Admiral Heihachido Togo, focused on disrupting Russian supply lines and communication networks. In March 1904, the Japanese launched a series of raids against Russian coastal towns and ports, including the strategic port of Vladivostok, which served as a key base for the Russian Pacific Fleet. These attacks not only hindered Russian naval operations, but also undermined the morale of their troops, who were already struggling to cope with the harsh Manchurian winter. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the Japanese army was preparing to launch a major assault against the Russian forces stationed at the strategic port city of Port Arthur. The city, which was heavily fortified and defended by over 50,000 Russian troops, was a crucial stronghold for the Russian naval presence in the region. In April 1904, the Japanese launched a series of attacks against the outer defenses of Port Arthur, aiming to weaken the Russian garrison and pave the way for a final assault on the city. The Japanese army, led by General Maresuke Nogi, employed innovative tactics, including the use of trench warfare and nighttime assaults, to outmaneuver the Russian defenders. The Russians, however, put up fierce resistance, and the fighting was intense and brutal. The Japanese suffered heavy casualties, but their superior artillery and logistical support allowed them to maintain a steady advantage over the Russian forces. As the siege of Port Arthur dragged on, the Russian commander, General Anatoly Stossel, found himself increasingly isolated and cut off from reinforcements. The Trans-Siberian Railway, which was supposed to be the lifeline of the Russian army in Manchuria, was unable to cope with the demands of supplying the large garrison at Port Arthur. The Japanese had successfully disrupted the railway, and the Russian troops were beginning to feel the effects of hunger, cold, and fatigue. In May 1904, the Japanese launched a final assault on the strategic hill of 203-meter Hill, which dominated the harbor of Port Arthur. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but ultimately, the Japanese emerged victorious, capturing the hill and gaining control over the port. The Russian garrison, realizing that their position was untenable, began to prepare for a last-ditch defense of the city. As the Japanese closed in on Port Arthur, the Russian naval commander, Admiral Wilhelm Wittjeft, attempted to break out of the harbor with his fleet, hoping to escape to Vladivostok and regroup. However, the Japanese Navy was waiting, and on August 10, 1904, the two fleets clashed in the Yellow Sea, resulting in a decisive Japanese victory. The Russian fleet was destroyed, and Admiral Wittjeft was killed in action. The loss of the Russian fleet at the Battle of the Yellow Sea marked a turning point in the war, as it gave the Japanese control over the sea lanes and allowed them to focus on capturing Port Arthur. The city, which had been under siege for months, finally fell to the Japanese on January 2, 1905, after a brutal and devastating assault. The Russian garrison, led by General Anatoly Stossel, surrendered, marking a major victory for the Japanese army. As the Japanese army consolidated its control over Port Arthur, it turned its attention to the strategic city of Mukden, which was the capital of Manchuria and a key stronghold for the Russian army. The Japanese commander, General Oyama Iwao, led a massive force of over 200,000 troops against the Russian garrison, which was commanded by General Alexei Kuropatkin. The Battle of Mukden, which began on February 20, 1905, would prove to be one of the largest and most decisive battles of the war. The Japanese army employed its characteristic tactics of speed, maneuverability, and surprise, quickly outflanking the Russian forces and cutting off their supply lines. As the battle raged on, General Kuropatkin became increasingly desperate, ordering his troops to launch repeated counterattacks against the Japanese lines. However, these efforts were ultimately futile, and the Russian army began to retreat in disarray. On March 10, 1905, the Japanese captured the city of Mukden, marking a major victory for their army. The fall of Mukden had significant consequences for the Russian war effort. The loss of the city and its surrounding territory meant that the Russians could no longer maintain a viable presence in Manchuria. The Japanese, on the other hand, had gained control over the entire region, including the strategic ports and railways. As the news of the Russian defeat at Mukden spread, the Russian government faced mounting pressure to negotiate a peace treaty with Japan. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was reluctant to surrender, but he was eventually persuaded by his advisors to seek a negotiated settlement. On March 24, 1905, the Russians and Japanese began peace talks in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, under the mediation of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The negotiations were tense and difficult, with both sides seeking significant concessions from each other. However, after several weeks of intense diplomacy, the two nations finally reached an agreement on September 5, 1905. The Treaty of Portsmouth marked the official end of the Russo-Japanese War, with Russia recognizing Japan's control over Korea and ceding to Japan the southern half of the island of Sakhalin. The treaty also provided for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Manchuria and a transfer of the Russian lease on the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. The Japanese had emerged victorious, having achieved their strategic objectives and gained recognition as a major world power. The Russians, on the other hand, had suffered a humiliating defeat, which would have significant consequences for their domestic politics and foreign policy. In the aftermath of the war, the Russian government faced widespread criticism and unrest, with many calling for reforms and greater accountability. The Tsar was forced to concede to some of these demands, establishing a constitutional monarchy and granting greater autonomy to the Russian people. However, the legacy of the Russo-Japanese War would continue to shape Russian politics and foreign policy for decades to come. The Japanese, meanwhile, were basking in the glory of their victory, with their military leaders hailed as heroes and their nation celebrated as a rising power. The war had marked a significant turning point in Japanese history, as the country emerged from its period of isolation and took its place on the world stage. The consequences of this emergence would be far-reaching, shaping the course of East Asian politics and international relations for generations to come. As the dust settled on the conflict, the two nations began the process of rebuilding and recovery. The Japanese set about consolidating their gains in Manchuria and Korea, while the Russians focused on regrouping and reassessing their military strategy. The world watched with interest as these two powers adjusted to their new roles, wondering what the future held for this volatile region. In the months that followed, the Japanese continued to consolidate their control over Manchuria, establishing a network of railways, roads, and telegraph lines to facilitate their administration of the region. They also began to promote economic development, encouraging Japanese investment and trade in the area. The Russians, on the other hand, were forced to withdraw their troops and abandon their claims to the region. The international community was closely watching the developments in East Asia, with many nations seeking to establish their own interests in the region. The United States, in particular, was keen to promote its own influence, using its diplomatic leverage to encourage Japan to adopt a more moderate approach to its foreign policy. The British, meanwhile, were concerned about the implications of Japanese expansion for their own colonial empire in Asia. As the great powers maneuvered and positioned themselves for the next phase of the Great Game, the people of East Asia looked on with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The Russo-Japanese War had marked a significant turning point in their history, but it was clear that the region would continue to be shaped by the complex interplay of national interests and global politics. The Russo-Japanese War was a pivotal moment in modern history, marking the emergence of Japan as a major world power and the beginning of Russia's decline as a dominant force. This conflict not only reshaped the balance of power in East Asia, but also sent shockwaves throughout the global community, influencing the course of international relations for decades to come. The echoes of 1905 continue to resonate today, a testament to the enduring importance of understanding our shared past. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.